welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for another live MakerFun activity today. We're pretty excited because we're learning all about the world of flight. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sarah and I'm the program director for Brilliant Labs Nova Scotia.
My name is Jeff, and I'm a teacher, and I work with Brilliant Labs as well.
Okay.
All right. Well, let's get started today. Let's dig into this topic of flight. So, first thing I wanted to show you is I found this little clip that I thought was really neat. Have you ever seen one of these before? It's like this tube with this giant fan in the bottom, and the fan is so strong that it can lift people up into the air.
How amazing would that feel to be able to do? I'm not sure that there's any locally, but I'd love to give it a try.
But then it got me thinking about this, though. Does this count as flying? Is this person flying right now? What do you think? Does it qualify as flying, Sarah?
Well, I don't know if we were to define flying, or we're going to take a look at that, but I think
Yeah.
I would think more of like a hovering, maybe. If you've ever done the experiment where you have like a hair dryer and a ping pong ball, so you have this area of concentrated air that's moving up, and it looks like the ping pong ball is hovering, and that's technically not flying because it's only moving in that one channel of air. But I don't know. I wonder how our friends at
Yeah.
home think whether it's flying or not.
Yeah, me too. Well, let's dig into flight here.
Exactly. So, speaking of flight and air, the science of flight is called aeronautics. It's the study, the design, and the making of machines that are able to fly. And it's as well as studying the methods of using rockets and aircrafts in the atmosphere. But without air, nothing flies. So going back to that really cool video with the wind tunnel, we do have that component where we have air. So we do have moving air, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So the air pressure is essentially, it's what makes the wind blow. It's what helps birds glide through the air, and it's how we travel. It's a huge important part of how we travel through in airplanes, or hot air balloons, parachutes. And without air, nothing flies. So the difference between air pressure and the moving air, and you can see here in this picture with the airplane wing, is what creates something called lift. So that's what pushes up on the object, the plane, the bird, the person. And this is related to this great scientist from quite a long time ago named Bernoulli, and he studied all about the science of flying in air, and he was the one who named the Bernoulli Effect, which is talking about how air pressure changes from one area to another. It creates lift. There's other components that are involved with aeronautics in the science of flight. So when we are talking about like designing rockets and planes and anything, that's great. We don't design birds, but we certainly look at birds, and I'm sure that Bernoulli was probably inspired by birds when he was doing these theories. We are also talking about something called aerodynamics. So aeronautics is a science of flight. Aerodynamics is specifically what examines or really looks at the flow of air and the way it interacts with the objects in motion, such as the bird, the plane, or a person in a wind tunnel too.
Yeah, really cool. You mentioned something that made me think of something that you and I have discussed before. How sometimes humans make inventions, and we say that they invented it, but really they're just basing it on something that they found in nature. We call that biomimicry, when you take something that is done really well in nature and you turn it into a new invention. So I think that you might be right. Bernoulli was probably inspired by what's happening in nature around him.
Humans for years and years and years have been looking into the sky and wondering how, before we were able to put any creations up there, and we could talk about the history of flight, but that would take a long time. But there is the famous brothers called the Wright Brothers back in the early 1900s, so over 100, pretty much 120 years ago, they were the ones to create the first really manned or human-driven airplane. It was pretty simple and dangerous, but they were looking into the air and looking at birds and wondering how great would it be for us to do that. So there were a few people earlier like Bernoulli, and then some other people 100 years prior to that. So humans have essentially been studying how to fly and wanting to fly, and there's been some pretty crazy efforts and dangerous, but all in the inspiration of nature and seeing the wonderful freedom that birds and other animals and insects have when they're able to leave the ground. So this picture here shows an airplane, and it highlights the 4 principles of flight. So as I mentioned, we have the lift, which is we get from the air and it's moving around. We of course have the weight of the object, and the weight is also affected by a force called gravity. We have the thrust, which would be the power moving forward. So with airplanes, it's sometimes engines, sometimes there's propellers, there's a combination of things. Thrust from rockets would come from the initial ignition when it's moving up in the air, and that downward force pushing it up against gravity. So, and then we have drag. So drag is really, really important, and especially for the topics that we're going to be doing today in our Maker Challenge, where we're going to be specifically looking at the science of parachutes. Now, that's something that I always wanted to do. I always wanted to go skydiving, but a little part of me is a bit sheepish to do it. But it's still, it's not. I'm not too old. It's not too late. We might be something that comes up this summer. We'll see. So a couple of other things to consider with the flight and the principles and the science of it is that we, like I mentioned, we have the force of gravity. Okay, and when we have speed, speed is measured by looking at how far something has gone over how much time. So, for example, if I ran from the end of my yard to the other end of my yard, I know that that's approximately 40 meters. And if I'm able to do that in, well, let's be fair, maybe 30 seconds or a minute, then I could figure out how fast I was going. And we're not going to get too into that, but speed is a huge important thing when we're talking about flight and moving objects in the air, because you have to have enough speed to get to the acceleration required to stay up there. And like I mentioned, we're going to be, so we have these principles of flight with an airplane. And then Jeff, you had mentioned looking up in the air at birds. So let's take a look at that.
I was just remembering being on an airplane a couple of years ago, and when you're on that runway, like when the plane's about to take off, you feel it like really push that speed. So like it's trying to get that, take advantage of that lift so that it can take off. It needs that thrust forward in order to take advantage of those other forces.
Absolutely. Yeah. You can almost feel yourself pull back in your seat because of that. That's the amount of acceleration, that speed, that thrust to move forward. Your body's still in motion inside the plane, so you're being pulled back into your seat. Imagine if you didn't have seat belts or seats. There are some planes out there that are not passenger planes. There are people that are kind of just sitting in the open along the sides, usually if you're military or skydiving. And imagine being kind of thrown against everybody when you're taking off. So they have a different type of seatbelt that would strap across and then across their belt, their middle there too.
Well, thinking about our friends in nature that do this all the time, there's birds outside flying around my yard here today. The same stuff that Sarah's talking about that helps airplanes fly, our man-made inventions, it applies to our nature friends as well. So they're using that same aerodynamic forces that make it possible for all those different helicopters and rockets, our kites to fly, all those things. It takes the same forces. So when they flap their wings, they're creating the thrust that propels them through the air. And even their back tail, if you kind of see on one of my images as it comes up here, one of them uses his back tail almost to like steer and slow himself down. This guy right here, you can see how he bends his back feathers in to help him land. So they've got all the same basic, features and using the same forces that we use in our inventions.
Exactly. And so the back feathers of the bird is very much like the rudder of a boat or an airplane, because it does give you the ability, or the bird's ability, to steer, but it also gives you that that space for that moving air to lift and also thrust.
Yeah. So sometimes, people think about, well, why can't humans fly? Birds can do it. They have kind of like arms, kind of like we have. Why is it that they can fly and we can't? So I just thought it might be kind of cool to kind of point this out. So this is an albatross. This is a bird that lives by the ocean. And so this little shape that I put up here shows how wide its body is. And these shapes show that same width on its wings. So on each wing, he's got 5 widths of his body. It's kind of crazy. It's a very long span. Um, but thinking about a human, on the other hand, so if this is how wide the human's body is, it's only got 2 lengths of his body on the side. So our arm span is nowhere close to as wide as a bird's. So to kind of put that into more perspective here, if I was going to wear like a bird suit, this is kind of how big it would have to be in order for me to do it. I don't think I would have, I know I don't have it. The arm strength to be able to control those wings, they have to be really, really strong in order to do it. It's pretty cool to think. This guy's got it mastered. We've
Yeah,
seen this guy.
that's
He knows what
amazing.
he's doing.
You know, yeah, exactly. Because you'd have to, not only would you, if you got up there when you're not flying, how do you deal with these wings? And I have seen some pretty interesting pictures of things in the past, or people trying to replicate just exactly what you've highlighted there, Jeff. And your arms definitely would not be enough to support unless you have a different design. But then if you built, these people had like additional sticks, almost like hockey sticks, extended under their arms. But that's adding with the additional length, more weight. So then you still
True.
have to support that extra weight and yourself and whatever you're using for wings. So it's not really a feasible or safe thing to do is to try to fly at home. So we certainly don't encourage that.
Yeah,
But it's nice to dream.
doesn't work. Yeah.
So we wanted to play a little game here with who does it better.
Yeah. So what we'll do is we'll show 2 different little images. And for you in your classroom or at home, think about which one you think has flying figured out better, has mastered it better. If you are a teacher in our chat with us right now, we would love for you to drop your students' answers in. But let's get to the first one.
Sure.
All right. So option 1 is a drone.
Very
Option 2
cool.
is the hummingbird.
Yeah.
What do you think, Sarah?
Well, I've had the opportunity to maneuver and try to fly several types of drones before, not with a lot of success. Now, that's not necessarily due to the design of the drone, but for my lack of experience doing so. Although I can say that the designs of drones certainly make a difference in the quality and whether you can fly them inside or outside. But at some point, there's always a crash or a stuck in a tree or one of the rotators stop working. So, in my opinion, I'm looking at hummingbirds and I love looking at them around the flowers in summer. I very rarely see a hummingbird crash. They're very, very
Oh, yeah,
accurate with what they're doing. So
absolutely.
yeah, when they gather their food source, they're like just hovering there and can stay there for a while and then get their food and move along, and they're very precise with their movements. So
Yeah,
I'd have to say hummingbird in my opinion, but we haven't quite mastered the mimicry to have an object that's so good like a hummingbird.
we've got some
Okay.
answers from our participants here. Miss Murphy's class votes for the hummingbird. Miss Reardon's class says hummingbird as well. And Madame Sears' class voting for hummingbird with a few leaning towards the drone. So
Okay.
I
Yeah.
love watching hummingbirds too. I'd vote that way as well. To see them at our feeder here in the summer is always so cool to see, especially when the little babies come out. They're so cute when the baby
Yeah,
hummingbirds are. All right, let's get to the next one.
for
Round
sure.
2. All right, first up is the sugar glider. If you haven't seen one of these before, kind of like a flying squirrel, but it's related to the possum family of animals,
Yeah.
and it's from Australia. So, and he's got this flap of skin that attaches its arms and its legs. It looks so cool. It looks
It
like a
looks like it's
perfect
in someone's
rectangle, right?
house and it's a pet, maybe. I've only seen them I haven't seen them up close in nature, but I think we do have flying squirrels, which, like you said, is a different species in Canada. But this is really amazing. This little dude here.
Yeah, and option 2 is the wingsuit. So this is like a skydiver wearing a suit that's kind of like inspired by these sugar gliders, and they can propel themselves forward. So they're not like a normal skydiver kind of just goes more or less down. They can go forward direction because they're taking advantage of all those different forces so that they
Right.
can be thrusted forward. It's pretty
There's
cool.
thrusts forward, and then they have the drag, which is the air pressure pushing up, and then they have their weight and gravity pulling down. So it does give you a certain degree of control. And I don't know, that seems like a little bit more dangerous in my opinion than say parachuting or
Yeah.
skydiving, but it does look pretty cool.
They
Uh,
do end on a parachute. He does have a parachute on that
yes,
opens up to
yeah.
stop him. He doesn't just fly into the water or anything. But
No, no.
all right, Miss Murphy's class going with the sugar glider. We
Okay.
like nature.
Yeah,
Nature's
we
so
do.
impressive, eh?
Miss Reardon's
Need
class has a
more?
4 to
Oh,
5 for the sugar glider.
yeah, bit divide there. Some people think both.
Yeah,
All right, well, thanks for playing with us.
that's fine. Okay.
All right, well, so let's dig into this. We've brought up parachutes a bunch of times here,
Yeah.
and are we considering parachuting flying, or is it just skilled falling, I guess? And well, if we're thinking about this, a lot of these same principles of flight do apply to what we're doing here because there's still that drag that's slowing down the parachute so that it doesn't go so fast that the person is going to hit the ground too hard. It creates enough of that drag that it can slow it down. And just like how the airplane has weight and it needs that thrust to move forward, that parachute person as well, and also all their equipment works as weight as well. So a lot of the same features, but is it flight? I don't know. I don't think I would use the word flight to
You know,
describe it,
there's
although it does have a lot of the same principles.
it does follow the same principles, and you're going to be using flight in one mode or another to get up there, but the actual falling out of the plane, I don't know. That's up for debate. I would say it's controlled falling, but if we're using the principles of flight, they do certainly apply. So by
Yeah.
definition, it could definitely considered flight.
And the larger your parachute as well, the more resistance or like the more air that kind of gets pushed up against your parachute makes it go slower. So the larger the
Right.
parachute, the slower the descent or how it's falling down. So things to
And yeah, so
consider in
there's
our
so many
challenge.
things to consider. And we're going to kind of get into that because that's going to be our fun maker challenge of the week. Um, we're going to be, yeah. So, I mean, there's certain things I'm looking at that I'm already thinking, oh my goodness, what if there's a hole in a parachute or like something like that? So why don't we go ahead and introduce our challenge and then kind of
Yeah.
talk about the things we want to consider while doing our challenge.
So if you've been here with us before, you know that we love to make things and we like to get you making things. So our maker challenge today is using the materials that you have available. You're going to design and test a parachute that will reduce drag enough that your weight or whatever you have to make fall with your parachute will be slowed down versus if you just like took it and dropped it to the ground. So we're trying to add a whole bunch of drag so that it's going to slow it down.
Exactly. And then if you really wanted to later to get fancy, you could try your object without the parachute and time it from the same distance, how long it takes to hit the ground, and then use it with the parachute and see just how much of a difference that having that additional space to create that drag force that allows you to land safely. So I just brought a few items today to work on our challenge together. And I have a little Lego, I think it's Minecraft person here. So I'm going to be using that when I do my experiment. And then the main thing is that you want to think about what you're going to use for your actual shoot, the parachute part of it. And when we're considering the weight of the object, we also want to, Jeff, you had mentioned you want to make sure that we don't have too small of a parachute. And one way to look at that is look at the overall circumference, which is the circumference of a circle or a parachute or whatever is the distance to go completely around once in of the piece of paper or plastic or material, whatever you're using. And the diameter of a circle is the segment that cuts across the circle in half. So those are things that you can consider. And if you're looking at kind of incorporating some math into this, you can take note of that. And if you're going to try different parachutes, you can measure. You got a ruler, you can calculate the circumference, or you can even measure the circumference using a piece of string around it and then measure the piece of string. Other things to consider, I mentioned materials. So I have some coffee filters here, which is the type of paper. It's fairly thin. But if I was to drop it, you can see that it doesn't just fall super quick. For example, like the Lego person here falls, but when I drop this, you can see it kind of floats down off to the side because of that drag, the air pushing up and it falling down. So the other part of the parachutes that we have noticed when people are flying and whatever is the strings or the cords. So these would be the aspects that attach to your circle that you're going to use for your parachute. And you want to make sure that you have enough. And you probably want to make sure that they're long enough so you don't want them super, super short. And then it wouldn't leave a lot of room for you to attach your person or your object. But it would also, you don't want to have them too long either. So, but this is where the experimentation comes in because you're going to want to try a few different things. So, what I was going to do is get like a hole punch and just carefully tie my parachute together. But when I go ahead and do that, I'll see how well that works. And then another object that I had, or another piece of material for the parachute, was just like a garbage bin bag that we have. Plastic bags are not as we don't have as many around since we moved over to non-plastic, but there still are some from garbage bags. So I just grabbed one and I'm going to cut through this one and cut at the triangle or corner here and kind of cut it into a, not quite like straight across, but almost a curve here. It's kind of like the half of the circle, the coffee filter. And attaching cords to that, that's going to make a difference because how many I put on there, the spacing. So these are all things that we don't have the answer for you because that's where you're going to have the design process where you think about what you're dropping, how heavy it is, what your material is, how much cord you have, how long those cords are going to be. And I would say that to take into consideration that you want to have the cords be roughly the same length each. So that it's always good to have a ruler on hand when we're making. So when we want to make sure that we keep things constant, then we'd be measuring, say I want 9 inches for my, or 90 centimeters for my cords, and then I would decide how many I need of those. And I just have to cut it once and then do the same thing several times over.
Yeah, easier to start with a piece that's a little bit too long than it is to have a piece that's too
Exactly.
short to
You can always
start
trim,
long
but
and
you
go from there.
can't go back.
Yeah,
Exactly. That's right.
I have similar materials to you, sir. I have a piece of plastic that I've cut from a bag. I've got some string, and I wasn't sure if string or elastics would be better. I was going to experiment with
Interesting.
using elastics as the cords that attach my little character to the parachute. So,
Yeah.
whatever you have access to, whether you're at home or school, I've got some listed up here. It's we're not picky about what materials you use, so whatever you have access to, use that to try and build your epic
Yeah,
parachute tonight.
exactly. Whatever you have, yarn, string. I really like the idea that you're thinking about using something like elastics because that gives it that kind of extra ability to move, and it's not so rigid or tight. But I'm not sure if that's something that parachutes in real life have. I don't know if they're stretchy cords or if they're not. So that's something interesting I'd have to look up.
Yeah, we'll test it out.
Exactly. So
But
that's
that
one.
is
Oh,
oh, sorry. I
sorry.
was going to say that's one thing we do stress is that we don't think that this is like a try it once and then be done activity. We're hoping that you'll test your design and then make some observations about how it went and make changes to your design based on how your experiment's going to see if you can make improvements as you go. I do have one more thing just as we're wrapping up here, Sarah. I wanted
Of
to
course.
show.
Yeah.
I had the idea, we love using technology and stuff as well. So I have my little character here. He is attached an elastic band to a microbit, which is
Nice.
like a microcomputer. It's this tiny little computer that has lots of different sensors. And one of the sensors it has is called an accelerometer. And cell phones have accelerometers too, but they can track how it's moving.
Right.
So by attaching this onto my character and using a little bit of code, so I'll just pop it up on the screen so you can see, um, I've written just a couple lines of code so that my computer will get some data from this. So as my character falls, I can see how that accelerometer is getting a reading. So, if in a classroom, if you had a couple microbits around, or even Sphero, there's that robot toy Sphero has the same accelerometer built in. So
Right.
using a little bit of code, you can capture some data to find out just how much drag your design has added.
That's great, and it's always great to have that extra data to use and look at, and when you're able to get that precise measurement, that data, then you can certainly look at where, when, and where you see that change in the acceleration. And again, if if you don't have a microbit, but you do have a timer, a stopwatch, and you can measure the distance at which you're dropping your person or object on a parachute and then time it how long it takes to hit the floor, then you can easily at least calculate the speed, because it's distance over time if you want to find out how fast your
Yeah.
person was falling.
And if you do want to experiment with something like microbits and you don't have access in your classroom, teachers, you can just get in touch with us and
Of course.
we can help you out, get some of that
For,
stuff in your classroom.
for sure, take the experiment to the next level.
Yeah.
Okay. So questions to consider today. So we talked a lot about the forces, the four principles of flight, and the forces that an object in motion in the air experience. So thinking about that, and as you're doing your design, what forces really do affect how a parachute works? Which design aspects or things that you individually decided to do um, are what is important for your parachute to be successful, and how does that translate into the real world when people are designing parachutes, because people do this for a living, and it's very important. Like I said, there's a lot of, not just for fun skydiving, there's a lot of really practical and important uses for parachutes. So that's a lot. You have to really know what you're doing because you have people's safety
Mhm.
to think about. And then after your experiment, we would love to hear, see everything that you do. We would like to know what you would recommend if you were to be a designer for parachutes. And you essentially you are, because that's what you're going to be doing. But let us know what worked, what didn't work. Maybe you have an idea for parachutes that are being used in industry, and the real world are out there, that beyond the classroom or your home. Maybe you come up with some ideas that you would love to share, or keep to yourself, and maybe maybe
Save
plan
it till
that
you.
and no. But it all starts with making, and there's lots of youth and people who have created really great things through the process of what we're doing here, is learning, watching nature, building, making, sharing, and that's how we learn, and that's how we share. Speaking of sharing, we would love for you to share your inventions with us. As always, we had such a great response from our session with the Keep Out the Cold. So thank you so much for those who are on this session and shared. We would love to see how your parachutes work. Tell us what you used, what didn't work. If you have videos, if you're able to use a microbit, please, please, please. And our information is there so that teachers, educators, parents can see where to send us your awesome footage.
Thanks everybody for joining us today. We hope you
Thanks
have a
again.
lot of fun building your parachutes.
And stay tuned because we're going to be having another Maker Fun challenge next week.
Yeah. All
Have
right.
a great week.
Thanks everybody.
Thank you. Bye.